October 1944. The Pacific Ocean was no longer a body of water. It had been transformed into a global industrial furnace. Thousands of miles from any coastline, the two most powerful maritime machines in human history were converging for a final, grinding mechanical collapse. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a conflict so massive it defied the maps of the era. But while the history books focus on the great carriers and the legendary admirals, the real soul of the war was found in the small boys, the destroyers. These were the tin cans, ships built of thin 3/8-inch steel plates. No heavy armor, no massive citadel. Just a frame, a few boilers, and a crew that lived with the constant vibration of the turbines through the soles of their boots. Among them was the USS Johnston, DD-557, a Fletcher-class destroyer, freshly forged in the shipyards of Seattle and sent into the blue. To look at her was to see the peak of mass-produced American engineering. She was sleek, fast, and lethal, carrying 5.5-inch/38 caliber dual-purpose guns. But in the grand calculus of a naval war, she was the expendable part, a fuse in a larger circuit. On October 25th, that fuse was about to be pushed through a voltage it was never designed to handle. Every machine needs a ghost. For the Johnston, that ghost was Commander Ernest E. Evans. Evans wasn't a man of soft words or political maneuvering. He was a man of the academy, but he carried the lineage of the Cherokee and Creek nations in his veins. He was a warrior in an officer's cap. When the Johnston was commissioned, Evans didn't give his crew a lecture on naval tradition. He gave them a warning. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go into harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. He wasn't joking. Evans understood the industrial noir of his era, that the ship was merely an extension of the man, and the man was merely a tool for the mission. He paced the bridge with a grim, stoic intensity. He knew the Johnston was outclassed. He knew that a Fletcher-class destroyer displacement was only about 2,050 tons standard, less than the weight of a single turret on a Japanese battleship. But Evans didn't deal in odds. He dealt in momentum. He was waiting for the moment when the metal would meet the fire, and on the morning of October 25th, off the coast of Samar, that moment arrived with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. Dawn off Samar, the small American task unit, Taffy 3, was performing routine anti-submarine patrols and support for the troops on Leyte. It was a backwater assignment. 6 small Jeep escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. They were the periphery of the fleet. Suddenly, the horizon didn't just change, it erupted. Out of the morning mist, the Imperial Japanese Center Force emerged like monsters from a pre-industrial myth. 4 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and in the center of them all, the Yamato. The Yamato was the largest battleship ever built. Its displacement was over 70,000 tons. Its primary armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns. To put that in perspective, a single shell from the Yamato weighed as much as a Cadillac. If the Johnston was a mosquito, the Yamato was a mountain. The American pilots in the air couldn't believe their eyes. They radioed back, "I can see pagoda masts. I repeat, pagoda masts." The Japanese had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait. They were here to massacre the landing forces, and the only thing standing in their way was Taffy 3, the unreachables, the thin-skinned, slow, and forgotten. Admiral Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, realized he had two choices: run and be slaughtered, or fight and hope for a miracle. He ordered his ships to deploy smoke screens and ordered the destroyers to attack. Ernest Evans didn't wait for the signal to be completed. He didn't wait for the other destroyers to form up. He ordered the Johnston to flank speed, 36 knots. The ship's 4 boilers roared to life, burning oil at a rate that made the funnels scream. The Johnston turned 180 degrees and began a solitary, suicidal sprint toward the entire Japanese fleet. The physics of the situation were insane. The Johnston had to close within 10,000 yards to fire her torpedoes. The Japanese battleships were already ranging her from 30,000 yards. For 20 minutes, the Johnston was a target for the most powerful guns on Earth. Huge colored splashes, dye-loaded shells used to track accuracy, blossomed around the ship like demonic flowers. Yellow, red, green, blue. Evans stood on the bridge, refusing to take cover. He watched the splashes. He chased the salvos, steering the ship into the exact spot where the last shell had hit, gambling that the Japanese gunners would correct their aim away from that spot. It was a high-stakes game of mechanical chess, played at 40 miles per hour on a shifting liquid board. The Johnston was now deep inside the no-man's land of the Philippine Sea. At 10,000 yards, she was close enough to see the individual rivets on the Japanese heavy cruisers. Commander Evans gave the order that would change the course of the battle. Fire torpedoes. 5 21-inch Mark 15 torpedoes leaped from their tubes. These were not just weapons. They were complex, autonomous machines. Miniature submarines carrying 800 pounds of Torpex explosive. They hissed into the water, leaving white wakes that pointed straight at the heart of the Japanese center force. One of them found its mark. The heavy cruiser Kumano, a massive 13,000-ton Predator, was struck directly in the bow. The explosion was so violent that it didn't just damage the ship, it amputated it. The entire forward section of the Kumano disintegrated, sending a shockwave through the Japanese line. The tin can had bitten off the head of a giant. But in the world of industrial war, every action has a violent reaction. By closing the distance to fire her sting, the Johnston had exposed her fragile throat. At 7:30 a.m., the Johnston's luck ran out. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Kongō, followed by 3 6-inch shells from a cruiser, struck the ship almost simultaneously. Imagine the physics of this moment. A 14-inch shell weighs as much as a small car and travels at over 2,000 feet per second. When they hit the Johnston, they didn't just explode, they passed through her 3/8-inch steel skin like a needle through silk. They detonated in the aft engine room and the fire room. The result was a mechanical apocalypse. The ship's speed dropped from 36 knots to 17 knots. The power to the steering gear was severed. High-pressure steam lines carrying vapor at 850 degrees Fahrenheit, 454 degrees Celsius, ruptured, instantly cooking the men in the engine spaces. The Johnston wasn't just wounded, she was being hollowed out. Smoke, black and oily, began to pour from the gaping holes in her side. And for a moment, the Japanese gunners thought she was finished. They shifted their fire to the carriers, leaving the dead destroyer to drift in the rain. Commander Evans was still on the bridge when the shells hit. The blast had stripped the shirt from his back and sliced off 2 fingers on his left hand. His chest was a road map of shrapnel wounds. But he didn't go to the infirmary. He didn't even sit down. With the bridge steering gone, Evans moved to the aft steering house, a tiny, cramped iron box at the back of the ship. There was no radio, no intercom. To steer the ship, Evans had to shout orders down through a hatch to men below, who manually turned the massive iron rudder with their bare hands. This is the industrial Noir in its purest form. A half-naked, bleeding commander standing over a hole in the deck, physically tethered to the machine he refused to let die. The Johnston was a wreck, its radar destroyed, its speed halved, and its crew decimated. But under the squall of a tropical rainstorm, the crew managed to restore partial power. Evans looked out at the carrier Gambier Bay, which was being hammered by Japanese cruisers, and he made a choice that defies military logic. He ordered the Johnston, his broken, limping Johnston, to attack again. Because the electrical systems were fried, the 5-inch guns couldn't use the automated fire control computers. The men had to aim by sight, guessing the lead and the range. More importantly, the automated hoists that brought shells from the magazines were dead. The men formed human chains, a bucket brigade of steel. Each 54-pound, 24-kilogram shell and its powder casing had to be passed by hand, from the deep, dark magazines, up the ladders, through the smoke-filled corridors, and into the smoking breeches of the guns. In the 100 degrees Fahrenheit heat of the tropical morning, these men became part of the ship's internal combustion. Their muscles were the pistons. Their sweat was the lubricant. They were firing at such a rapid rate that the paint on the gun barrels began to blister and burn, filling the turrets with toxic fumes. They weren't just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting the heat, the exhaustion, and the very limits of what a human body can endure when it is integrated into a failing machine. For 3 more hours, the Johnston acted as a shield, weaving between the carriers and the Japanese heavy cruisers, drawing fire that should have sunk the entire task force. By 9:40 a.m., the Johnston was no longer a ship. She was a floating charnel house of twisted iron and scorched paint. She had spent 3 hours in a mechanical fever dream, charging giants and spitting fire until her barrels were smooth. But the Japanese center force had seen enough. 5 Japanese destroyers, led by the cruiser Yahagi, began to close the circle. This was the industrial Noir execution. The Japanese ships didn't fire from miles away. They closed in like wolves, their sleek, dark hulls cutting through the whitecaps. They began to cross the Johnston's T, pouring concentrated fire into the destroyer from every angle. Commander Evans, still standing at the aft steering hatch, was orchestrating a symphony of defiance with a ship that had no voice left. The Johnston was being hit so many times that the vibrations were constant, a rhythmic hammering of steel on steel. The deck was slick with a mixture of seawater, blood, and the black, viscous fuel oil that leaked from her ruptured tanks. At 9:45 a.m., the last engine died. The vibration that had defined the ship's life since the day she was launched in Seattle finally stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosions. At 10:10 a.m., the Johnston began to settle by the bow. She was taking on the Pacific at a rate her pumps could no longer fight. Commander Evans, his body a map of shrapnel and burns, looked at what remained of his crew and gave the final heavy order: abandon ship. There was no panic. There was only a grim, exhausted obedience. The men slipped into the water, clinging to debris and oil-soaked nets. As the Johnston rolled over onto her port side, the sea began to rush into her hot, dying boilers, creating a final, agonizing hiss of steam that could be heard for miles. One survivor remembered looking back as the ship's stern rose into the air. He saw the propellers, the massive bronze blades that had driven them into harm's way, standing still against the gray sky. And then, the Johnston began her long, silent slide into the dark. She didn't just sink. She plummeted, leaving a massive swirl of black oil and white foam where 10,000 tons of American audacity had just been. Ernest Evans was not among those who surfaced. He had entered the water with his ship, choosing to remain part of the iron that had defined his life's greatest work. As the survivors drifted in the oil slick, expecting the Japanese destroyers to return and finish them with machine guns, something occurred that has become a legend in naval history. The Japanese destroyer Yukikaze cruised slowly through the wreckage. The American sailors looked up, terrified, into the muzzles of the Japanese guns, but the guns remained silent. On the bridge of the Yukikaze, a Japanese officer, traditionally identified as the ship's captain, stood at the railing. He didn't look at them with hatred. He looked at them with a profound, professional awe. He had watched this tin can charge battleships for 3 hours. He had seen a machine made of thin steel refuse to die. In a final act of Bushido, the warrior's code, the Japanese captain stood at attention, and saluted the sinking Johnston and the men who had served her. It was a moment where the industrial noir of the war was briefly pierced by a sliver of ancient honor. The machine was gone, but the spirit of the combatants had left an indelible mark on the enemy. The Japanese fleet turned away, leaving the survivors to the mercy of the sea. For 77 years, the Johnston was a ghost, a name in a book, lost in the deepest, most crushing parts of the Philippine Trench. Then, in 2021, the world saw her again. An expedition led by Victor Vescovo reached a depth of 21,180 feet, over 4 miles down. The footage returned by the ROV was like a transmission from another dimension. At those depths, there is no light, and the pressure is over 9,000 pounds per square inch. Yet, there she was. The Johnston sits on the edge of an underwater canyon, her hull twisted from the pressure, but her identity undeniable. The cameras panned across the bridge, past the twisted 5-inch gun turrets that were still trained to the side, and finally rested on the hull. Through the silt and the rust, the numbers 557 were still visible. She hasn't changed. She is still at battle stations. She is a monument of industrial noir, a skeleton of mass-produced steel that proved, for one morning off Samar, that the size of the machine doesn't matter as much as the heart of the man who drives it. The story of the USS Johnston isn't just about a battle. It's about the friction between human will and mechanical limits. Ernest Evans and his crew didn't win because they had better equipment. They won because they refused to accept the logic of their own destruction. They were a tin can that broke the teeth of a dragon. Today, the Johnston remains the deepest shipwreck ever explored, a silent sentinel in the dark. As we look at the rust and the shadows, we have to ask ourselves, in a world of increasingly cold, automated machinery, do we still have the spirit to go into harm's way when the odds are zero? Thank you for joining us for this descent into the Pacific abyss. If you found honor in the story of Hull 557, subscribe and hit the bell. Our next journey takes us to the floating factories of death, the Essex carriers, and the fire from the sky that tried to melt them. The ocean is deep, and the history is rusted. See you in the dark.